Welcome to the JASN podcast. I'm Josie Briggs, Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of the American Society of Nephrology. This is my final JASN podcast. As many of our listeners know, the JASN editors are appointed for 6-year terms, and every 6 years, a new editor-in-chief is appointed, and a new group of editors brought on board to steer the journal forward for the next 6 years. Here with me today is Raj Mehrotra, who I'm delighted to say is about to assume the job of JASN Editor-in-Chief. Raj is head of the Division of Nephrology at the University of Washington, Seattle. He is currently Editor-in-Chief of JASN, and as of January 1st, he will switch jobs, switch chairs, and be, to my delight, the Editor-in-Chief of JASN. Raj, thanks for joining me for this conversation, and congratulations on your new job.
Thank you, Josie. It has been the honor and privilege of my professional lifetime to have served as the Editor-in-Chief of JASN and now of JASN. It is not something that I envisioned, a career path I would take, but here I am. But before we go on, I think this is you and your team deserve congratulations for the outstanding job that you have done in leading JASN for these past 6 years. It was a difficult time during the COVID pandemic, in addition to all the changes that are happening in the publishing world. And in my opinion, JASN is presently in the strongest position it has ever been. As an example of that, the journal impact factor for JASN has increased for it to be higher than 10 for the first time ever under your leadership. And your team deserves tremendous credit for the prestige and honor that surrounds the journal that is only enhanced under your leadership.
Well, thank you, Raj. I've put together and had the support of a wonderful team. And I know from your superb leadership of JASN, you know what you're getting into. These are wonderful jobs. They're interesting jobs, but they absorb many hours and force many complex decisions. So one thing to talk about at the beginning is you've put together a really superb team. I'm sure our listeners will want to hear how you approached this.
You know, I think the way I approach roles such as when I was the Editor-in-Chief of JASN or now of JASN is that I think the hardest job is to ensure that I put together the best team I possibly can. And I think you made a comment just a few minutes ago saying exactly that. And then so I approached that with that in mind, that my most difficult task is what it is that I put into in assembling this team. What I looked for primarily was diversity of scientific expertise. JASN covers a much broader breadth of scientific expertise than JASN because it covers thematically not just the basic science, but not just the clinical science, but also basic science. I tried to emphasize geographic diversity, including from outside the United States. What was important is to ensure that JASN is a place that welcomes the best science published in any corner of the world. Diversity of years of experience. I think each one of us brings, evolves over time, and those viewpoints are important. And finally, demographic diversity. To kind of balance all of those, I'm delighted with the result in approaching an intentional approach to assembling the team. These are outstanding individuals that are leaders in the field that have agreed to devote the next 6 years to the job at hand.
The team is really terrific. I can't help but notice that with delight, that you have 9 women out of 19. And this is certainly, in my mind, there's no doubt when you want to get the work done, this is the way to go. The team is also a strong mix of basic and clinical scientists. I know from our earlier discussions, you intend to maintain the mix in JASN of aiming to publish the very best of both clinical and basic work. How do you see the mix? How do you see the synergism between the two? And do you see the emphasis as evolving or changing?
Let me just quickly address the issue of the women and as members of the team, wearing my hat as division head in what I see in who is going into nephrology within our fellowship program, 3/4 of all our fellows are women. So I think the team reflects the evolving demographics of nephrology and nephrology science around the world. Getting back to the most important question of the strong mix of basic and clinical science that JASN has historically maintained, I do not envision any of that changing. JASN will maintain its traditional mix of the best of both clinical and basic science. And my hope is that it maintains an equal mix of, we've been intentional in selecting members of the editorial team to balance the expertise. As you know well, journals in the end are limited to selecting from amongst the articles that we receive. And so it is my hope is that, as has been the case in the past, we continue to receive the best of basic science as much as the best of clinical science. To underscore that emphasis, I just wanted to highlight two different new invited article types that we are hoping to introduce. The first of them is entitled Mechanisms of Disease. I just want to acknowledge that even though the title, Mechanisms of Disease, and for there then to be a section in the table of contents that says that would be new and different, that has always historically been the case that JASN has published review articles that describe the state of the art of mechanistic basis of kidney disease and its complications. All we would be hoping to do is to be a little bit more intentional in that regard, and then to have that umbrella where it'll be like a place for people to find where the latest articles on mechanisms of disease are on the website, say at JASN. The second is entitled Innovators Corner. A lot of the advances that happen in science come from work that is done by publicly funded labs, such as the NIH in the United States. Many of those innovations then have the potential for and go on to be important advances in the care of people with diseases, including kidney diseases. The purpose of the Innovators Corner is to highlight the work that has been done in labs around the world, where the discoveries that they have made have potential for either advancing substantially a mechanisms of disease or new therapeutic targets for treatment of disease. So it's a long way of saying that the emphasis that traditionally JASN has maintained in publishing the best of clinical and basic science will continue with our present team.
Terrific. Another issue you mentioned, the age range of your team. Our team, my deputies and I, are reasonably senior in the field. And so Tom Hostetter, Mark Nepper, Don Wesson, and myself are all have had many years of experience. And I do think one of the things that comes out of this passing of the guard is that your team is just a little younger. But the thing we have done to enrich our dialogue with and to make sure that we capture the insights of the early career scientist is our editorial fellowship program. I think you're aware of it. Each year for the last 5 years, we have brought in 10 early career scientists, and they participate actively in all stages of our editorial process. Gather you are planning to continue having a fellowship program. Any comments on how you see this program evolving?
I think first I want to congratulate you for conceiving the idea of having editorial fellows and then starting the editorial fellowship program. It is one of the things that I've said for a long time since I became the editor-in-chief of JASN is that there's nothing that we do professionally that prepares us to being an editor, except now I can say, if you have been an editorial fellow in the past, that does actually prepare you to be that. And my hope also is that the program allows these early career scientists to be better scientists, not only in the research that they pursue, but also in the way they present their research in years to come that they will have. I'm still, as you know, at JASN, we have not had that program. And so these past few months, I've tried to get my arms around how the program functions. I've been thoroughly impressed with the breadth and depth of experience the journal is able to offer. And my hope is that we continue that largely unchanged in the way it has been thus far. While saying that, I also want to acknowledge that there will be a learning curve for the new editorial team as they become editors themselves. And then there's a learning curve that I personally will have in working with editorial fellows. And so I will urge patience and grace from the editorial fellows in this time of transition. I would also add is that I think there is an opportunity potentially for us to consider extending the editorial fellowship program to CJASN. Kidney 360 has one already. This would not be that these present fellows would work with CJASN, but I know that Connie, who's the incoming editor for CJASN, is very keen on having a trainee program, and I cannot think of a better template than the JASN Editorial Fellowship Program.
Well, thank you. I actually modeled this program on one developed by Rita Redberg for the JAMA Internal Medicine, and I think she deserves credit for the idea. And we certainly thought of this as kind of part of our educational mission. But what I have really been surprised by, I think all of us keep saying this, is how it really, the dialogue that one has with an earlier career scientist and the perspective they bring to this work. These are, by the way, not beginners. They are all people launching their own careers as researchers. The dialogue has really enriched our editorial discussions, and the learning is going in both ways. But certainly we've all really enjoyed dialogue with an editorial fellow that precedes our group discussion. And I think we all feel that these early career scientists enrich our processes. We spend a lot of time talking about the papers we finally accept. We put a lot of work into what to ask to. We take the very best and we try to make them to give the authors advice to make them a little better. And I think that's something all rigorously peer-reviewed journals take pride in. But certainly our editorial fellows have helped us do a good job. Now, another question that editors get asked is about selectivity. As you know, JASN's currently publishing only about 10 or 12% of the submitted manuscripts. I believe the same has held true for CJASN under your leadership. Is this the best thing for the field, this high degree of selectivity? What's the rationale? What are the arguments for journals publishing only a small portion of what comes in the door?
Indeed, that is a question that I've grappled with as well, just like you're describing, and I will continue to grapple as I transition to JASN. The way I have thought about the papers that we publish is to identify, at least in my mind, absolutely things that I can say are ways we judge papers. And I would say there are four things that I look for when I look at a paper. The first is the research question important? The second is, are the findings, if valid, are a meaningful advance over what we already know? Are the findings internally valid? And that is, in basic science, more commonly used phrase is that in the way the work is done, would this be reproducible? Can we stand behind the methods that they have used and the way that they have explored the question? And are these externally valid? I know those are the same metrics, parameters broadly that JASN uses and other selective journals use. In the way that I think about this is that if every article that we receive meets those benchmarks, we'll publish them. So this is not to say that a lot of the science we're receiving is not good. It is, at least in our judgment, not a meaningful advance over what has already been published. I think there are reasons for us to be selective. The first I would say is that we are putting the weight and prestige of an ASN journal behind that work, and we have to be confident that we believe that the article does all that we say it does to the best we can at the time we accept the paper. So it is a heavy responsibility that we are trying to fulfill. The second thing I would say is that, in outlining explicitly in what the expectations are for papers that we feel are a meaningful advance and are internally and externally valid, is that elevates at least the expectations and hence the work that is put into advancing science in the field more broadly. So I think, I do not expect much change with regards to selectivity at JASN from what it has been under your leadership.
Well, thank you. I think you articulate these issues very well. Sometimes the hardest one is novelty, and we struggle a lot with larger scale confirmations of things we think we already know. And certainly the question of, is this important? I think we all have, coming into our computers every day, more to read than we can read. And knowing that a critical team has looked at this and feels this is worthy of your attention is certainly something that affects my readings. You know what? An unrelated topic that I've worried about a lot and that's discussed a lot in our field is the shortage of rigorous controlled trials in nephrology. Early in our term, in 2019, we published an article that analyzed the number and quality of trials in nephrology. First author was Marcus Chisholm-Manui. Senior author was Hans-Jochen Anders. The main finding in that paper, which I don't know if you remember it, was that nephrology had strikingly fewer RCTs than most other clinical fields, about a tenth that in cardiology, but less than gastroenterology, pulmonary, all the other clinical fields. It was a follow-up to a very similar study published in 2004 by Stripoli and co-authors. That's 15 years before, and the findings were virtually identical, with, again, cardiology having about 10 times as many trials. I worry in our field that the challenges of performing trials is keeping us from getting this ultimate rigorous test of what people think we know. What as journal editors do you think we can do to increase recognition, to perhaps increase reluctance to accept as causal the associations in observational work? I'm curious, and I know you're very aware of this as a clinical researcher yourself and as sometimes a trialist, but why is nephrology lagging and what can we do about it?
Of course, I bemoan the limited number of clinical trials in our field, like other people in the field. I have a whole host of disparate thoughts that I will try to succinctly elucidate.
Good.
The first is that other than, say, diabetic kidney disease or kidney diseases, primary kidney diseases are rare diseases. Like if you think of, say, primary glomerular diseases, these are rare diseases. And so the infrastructure that is necessary to execute a clinical trial needs to be more robust and widespread than, say, in doing PCI for coronary artery disease. The second thing, which I think my hope is with things such as KPMP and other scientific innovations we get a better handle on, is the underlying heterogeneity, even amongst diseases that we think are the same. And like, for example, I specifically am thinking of, say, diabetic kidney disease. And the reason I say that is because there's a lot of, we've had recent successes, of course, with the SGLT2 inhibitors, with finerenone and drugs such as that have generated a lot of excitement, but our field also is replete with a large number of negative clinical trials. And that, I think, discourages investigators or funders to go down that path. And that includes not just public funders, but also pharma to pursue clinical trials in patients within our field. The third is, and this is like something in the way my personal thinking has evolved, is as important as mortality is as an outcome, as important as progression of kidney disease is important as an outcome, there are many more outcomes that are important to our patients that nephrology is historically not focused on, where you actually do not need large clinical trials. And I'm specifically thinking of, say, patient-reported outcomes. It has been my interest in looking, for example, at patients with depression or with insomnia or pain or things such as that, where you do not need large clinical trials. And then finally, there are a whole host of innovations in trial design that are happening through the biomedical sciences that we need to more readily adapt and operationalize within nephrology. To that end, what we are hoping to start is a new series of articles on clinical trial design in the pages of JASN, where we will highlight a whole host of different trial designs, be it pragmatic trials, be it adaptive design, be it precision medicine clinical trials, also looking at outcomes. So I think the issue of clinical trials in nephrology is complicated. To your question, whether or not that is changing or will be changing, my hope is that it is, but change is incremental and slow and may not be easily perceptible. But I am an eternal optimist, and I would think that we will keep pushing the envelope in this regard.
Yeah, certainly the recent successes and certainly the meeting on late-breaking trials at the recent in Philadelphia, there was a new feeling of optimism. I was looking today, the FDA approved Tarpeyo for IgA and noticed that it's a rare disease. I said, IgA, that's a rare disease. So we don't think of IgA as really a rare disease, but you're right, from an industry perspective, this is seen as a rare disease. I think that the area and biggest gap I see are really what I would call process of care studies. And in process of care studies, a negative trial can be just as important as a positive one. But I am struck that there are many practical questions in how we care for patients that by focusing on patient-reported outcomes, patient sense of well-being, one can do without 3,000 patients. It sounds great. I'm glad that JASN is taking this on as well. And I know that one of the things you're going to be working to do is to kind of better integrate the mission of the three journals, which I think is really needed. So I mentioned at the beginning, this is the final JASN podcast. I understand you're developing a new format for the ASN publication team. Podcasts, which will combine some highlights from all three journals. Can you tell our listeners just a little about how you see this coming together?
So we've, a lot of that will be led by Matt Sparks. He is the new communications editor for the ASN portfolio. I can share at a high level what my vision would be is to replicate, if you were, the success of the Best of ASN Journal session at Kidney Week. We've had that since 2018. So this is actually the 6th year that we held that session. And Josie, you've been a partner in that over the years. As you have seen along with me, it evolved such that we are able to synthesize content from three journals into themes and then present that at Kidney Week. My hope is that we use that template such that we, for example, I could envision recent advances with SGLT2 inhibitors. Like that's a hot topic. There is content related to that therapeutic area across all three journals that we have. We invite the authors of the articles to engage in a conversation with Matt to understand what's been published and what it means for future either clinical care or research. That is what I envision. My hope is that moving away from, at least at JASN in the way we've had it one paper at a time, to synthesize information across three journals would be of value to the ASN members and to the listeners worldwide. And I welcome people's feedback on additional thoughts that they may have as we go down this path.
I think this is a great approach, and Matt Sparks will be a good person to be an integrator. It's not easy, it's hard. Well, just to wrap up, I've really enjoyed our conversation, and I'm so delighted you are taking on this complex leadership job. I also view my last 6 years as one of the great honors of my career, but at the same time, I am so delighted to have more hours in the day and to be able to turn to some of my own scientific work. But Raj, I do wish you the best going forward, and I thank you for taking time for this conversation.
Thank you, Josie, and thank you also for the completely seamless transition of editorial leadership at JASN and the tremendous work that you and your team have done. Wishing you all a happy holidays.
Happy holidays.
This podcast is copyrighted by the American Society of Nephrology. All rights reserved. All content in this podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended to be medical advice. This podcast should not be used in a medical emergency or for the diagnosis or treatment of any medical condition. Please consult your doctor or other qualified healthcare professional if you have any questions about any medical condition or before taking any drug, changing your diet, or commencing or discontinuing any course of treatment. Thank you for listening to this podcast from the American Society of Nephrology.